Every weekend, it's the Moore of Pittsburgh. Chris Moore. The Chris Moore Show. News Radio 1020 KDKA.
Well, welcome back. In the second hour of our program, please welcome historian and economist Dr. Webster Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley, welcome back. How are you, sir?
Thank you so much. Delighted to be with you.
All right. I want to start. There's a lot I want to cover with you, but I want to start with Ukraine. Some articles I've read on your tarpley.net website say that most of this propaganda that comes from NATO and others about President Putin being the aggressor in this campaign in the Ukraine really doesn't stem necessarily from whether he was an aggressor or not, but from the kinds of things that NATO and the United States and London have been doing. You say the main cause of the current conflict is the insistence by Washington and London on organizing a coup d'etat in Russia's largest and most strategically sensitive area. Could you outline what you mean, sir?
Yes. Well, people may be aware that over the last decade, maybe a little bit more, the United States has repeatedly organized what are called color revolutions in different countries around the world. And these are essentially a form of coup d'etat or putsch, which is disguised and camouflaged by having a bunch of gullible young people out there in the public square demanding all the good things, freedom, democracy, and all the rest. And then the CIA has essentially organized either the generals or other political forces inside the target country to overthrow the government. And that's pretty much what the Arab Spring was, right? Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Syria. In some of those, it has succeeded, right? In Tunisia, but in some others, it's failed. In Libya, I think Libya probably shows you where these things lead. They lead to absolute chaos. But anyway, there had been a color revolution in Ukraine back in 2004, so-called Orange Revolution, and that had brought in a pro-Western, pro-NATO government. And they decided that since a kind of a middle-of-the-road, halfway European, halfway Russian president, Yanukovych, had come in about 2010, NATO decided that they would get rid of him. So they'd organized a color revolution. The difficulty is that this time they didn't have the golden youth so much. They had actual Nazis and fascists. And I have to point to this problem with Ukraine, that when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when he got to Kiev, he was greeted with, when he got even before Kiev, he got to a place called Lvov. You have to look at the map, right? It's in the western part of Ukraine. It's close to Poland. And this has been a hotbed of pro-Nazi and pro-fascist thinking for a very long time. And when Hitler got there, the Wehrmacht, they found a guy called Stefan Bandera who tried to show the Germans what a good guy he was by killing a bunch of Jews, killing a bunch of Poles, and killing a bunch of Russians. So it started with a massacre, and that tradition, unfortunately, has remained. So when you saw the television coverage of what was happening in Kiev last autumn, last winter, and then up until February 21st, the people that were in that Maidan Square demanding that they join the European Union, a lot of them were actual neo-Nazis and neo-fascists. Some of them were in a group called the Svoboda Party. They want territory back from Poland. They want Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. Some of them were in the Fatherland Party. This woman, Yulia Tymoshenko, she's the one person people might know, the blonde with the pigtails. Mm-hmm. She says that she wants to kill pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine with nuclear weapons.
Well, in fact, they've killed people. They've herded them into places and set them on fire. And there have been photos with them waving Nazi insignia and the rest, but U.S. media hasn't really promoted that much. They've told the U.S. line. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, because they're the State Department and the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy and certain parts of the U.S. Agency for International Development and Freedom House and the Albert Einstein Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts are the backers and the architects, the engineers, right? The directors of this color revolution, I guess, except now the color revolution is not orange anymore. It's black or brown, right? The typical fascist colors.
Like the brown shirts.
Yeah, brown shirts of Hitler and black shirts of Mussolini. So this is what they are. So you look at the government, the current government in Kiev is chock full of Nazi sympathizers, fascist sympathizers. The people at the top in business suits are from the International Monetary Fund and the central banks. But the irony is that they're readying a killer austerity package. For example, doubling the price of natural gas used for cooking and for heating in a place that gets very cold in the winter because you're practically in the steppes. They want to have a situation where foreign interests can come in and steal some of the best farmland in the world, is the so-called Black Earth region of Ukraine. Then there's a huge complex of coal and iron and steel, the Donetsk, Donbass, and the Kryvyi Rog mining area. That was one of the main industrial areas of the old Soviet Union. There's a huge hydroelectric dam at Dnipropetrovsk on the Don River, and there's also a deal where Chevron apparently is going to get the entire gas distribution system given to them for nothing. So the place is going to be looted. I mean, it's just they're going to rob them blind. But that is what the International Monetary Fund has demanded, right? They call that privatization. Now, you look at all this from the Russian point of view. There was certainly a coup d'etat, no other way to put it, on February 21st and February 22nd. And it was assisted by the ambassadors of Poland, of France, and of Germany. They came in and ran cover for the people who were going to have the coup. The old president, Yanukovych, who was, pretty much par for the course, corrupt, whatever you want, but the elected president. No doubt about that either. They got him to sign this thing, and then within hours, the fascists were marching on the presidential palace, and the police ran away. Then Yanukovych ran away. According to the State Department now, if you're a president and you have to form a government in exile, then you're no longer the president.
Whether you were elected or not, huh?
Well, yeah, this guy, he ran, but then they illegally installed a new group, which is what you see. Turchinov, the president, and Yatsenyuk, the bald guy with the glasses, is the prime minister. They're both more or less stooges of the bankers, right? They're somewhat more restrained. So that's then the government. First thing they do is they say, we're banning the use of Russian. Well, in Kiev, in Odessa, and in the whole eastern and southern quadrants of Ukraine, Russian is the main language. Much of this area was an integral part of Russia. Much of it had never been part of Ukraine until the 1950s, right? Khrushchev somehow transferred some areas in there to try to make the Ukrainians feel better about themselves and about what was going on in Moscow. From the Russian point of view, though, this is a terrible threat. I just want to point to three things about Russia and see if you can see, if you don't agree with what I'm saying out there, try to give it the other guy's point of view, right? Russia has always been invaded from this direction, right? Coming through White Russia and Ukraine. That was the Poles in the 1600s, the Swedes in the 1700s, Napoleon in the 1800s, and Hitler in the 1900s, in the 20th century. The other thing about Russia is they've always tried to get access to the ocean, right, to the world ocean.
A warm water port.
The warm water port and an ice-free port. And Odessa is that, Sevastopol is that. The Crimea is a very warm area. It's a resort. It's a very nice climate, and there are ports there that don't freeze over. And then you have this problem about Nazism and fascism, right? You have to understand the Soviet Union, is what defeated Hitler, right? The D-Day was a heroic effort and certainly shortened the war. But the turning point of the war was not that. It was Stalingrad at the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943. That is pretty much the turn of the tide.
Mother Russia's winter helped in that regard, and people forget how many Russians died fighting the Nazis.
20 million. So here in the U.S., our losses are about 500, 600,000. With Russia, it's 20 million. So we have to give them something on this, and therefore they're very sensitive to the idea of having a fascist Nazi government occur on their border. Look at what the U.S. does, right? Communists come to power in Cuba, and the U.S. goes bonkers, and this hasn't ceased, right? Suppose we had a Nazi coup in Mexico of people who banned the use of English and made threats, right? They want territory back and so forth. You'd see.
They wanted Texas and California back. Right? We'd be in an uproar, wouldn't we?
There wasn't a stunt about that by the British.
Dr. Tarpley, let me interrupt you because I'm late for a break. I need to put these commercials in, and we'll get right back with you and hold that thought. Would you please, sir?
Sure.
All right. KDK Radio News Time, 5:22. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. Dr. Tarpley, given some of the border disputes that might erupt there, what kind of internecine warfare might we see in this area if NATO succeeds in separating Russia and the Crimea and the Ukraine and all the rest?
Ukraine, or what's left of it, rump Ukraine, I guess we can call it. They want that as a member state of NATO so that they can roll their artillery pieces and their aircraft right up to the Russian border. And you have to understand, this is really a very foolish thing to do. My thesis is that Putin is somebody who felt he had his back to the wall. 25 years ago, when we had German reunification, there was a pledge by the German government that they would not even let more NATO forces go into the old territory of East Germany, right? The area around Berlin and Leipzig and Dresden, right? And the German government says that they never have. In other words, there are no U.S. bases in what was East Germany. But unfortunately, under Clinton, we had this, I think, really crazy, lunatic, I would say, idea that Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, that they should become members of NATO. What was the reason for that, right, if you're looking forward to a future of peace? Then under Bush, it went even further, and we had these small countries, the so-called Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, that they were brought into NATO, and also Romania, and also Bulgaria. And you have to think what this means. Does an American want to fight and die for the freedom of Estonia or Latvia? And when you look into the politics of these little countries, you will see that hatred of Russia, right, Russophobia, anti-Russian racism, plays a big role in the politics, partly because there's a significant Russian minority in many of those places. And somehow these people think that they hate the Russians. Okay, this is maybe understandable, but then they say, and the antidote to the Russians is to honor the history of the Nazi SS, of Hitler, and the rest of these people. And at this point, I would have to say, from an American point of view, you guys are on your own. We're not going to fight and die for Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or similar places. And I think that applies especially to Ukraine. It applies to Georgia. You may remember that tin pot dictator Saakashvili, a fascist dictator, attacked Russia. He attacked in August of 2008. Don't let anybody tell you any different. He fired the first shots. He had a toy army. He thought he could get somewhere. That almost blew the lid off the world, because in the White House, Cheney was in favor of bombing the southern end of a tunnel that the Russians were using to bring military forces in. So he would have been bombing Russian tanks and trucks and killing Russians.
I shudder to think how close we have come, and with all these other conflicts. There are a lot of other subjects I want to cover with you. Libya, Iraq, and what's happened there, austerity programs in Europe, and so much more. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. We'll continue in a moment. News is next on KDKA. We hope that you will stay with us. We will continue our conversation with the Dr. Webster Tarpley. We want to talk about things that happened in Libya and those kinds of wars, Iraq. We'll talk about Sergeant Bergdahl as we will lead into our guest in our next hour, Donald Scales. So stay with us right here. Our number is 1-866-391-1020. You can also write us at the Dollar Bank Instant Access Center at our website, kdka.com. More with Dr. Tarpley in just a second. KDK Radio News Time, 5:32. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest as we continue to talk to him about a number of issues. Dr. Tarpley from the Dollar Bank Instant Access Center, we have this comment from Bryce. Would I be right in thinking that Hillary Clinton's State Department sponsored the color revolution in the Ukraine? If so, does this reflect on her presidential bid? Signed, Bryce.
Well, the first one was 2004, so that was under Bush the Younger, and then the more recent one actually started last year. But you're correct in this sense. Victoria Nuland, this foul-mouthed lady there in the State Department, if I can say lady, she is the one who tried to dictate and successfully dictated who would be president and who would be prime minister.
Who is her husband?
Donald Kagan, neocon, famous neocon at the American Enterprise Institute, and he was the top foreign policy advisor to Romney. So you see, there's a nest of neocons in the State Department. They thought they could get back to power by way of Romney, and that's Benghazi is essentially their attempt to do that. We can mention that in a minute. But Nuland also added that the U.S. had spent $5 billion on what she called democratic development. I would say funding fascism in Ukraine, and that $5 billion. You could fund Head Start. You could fund a lot of food stamps for $5 billion, and we're told we can't afford that. But there are some fascists in Kiev and Lvov who are riding high with our money, and then they want us to come in and bail them out. Notice, by the way, nobody wants to die for Ukraine, at least in very small numbers, right? With Crimea, and from weeks and weeks and weeks, nobody was offering themselves up, to do battle, and nevertheless they're all complaining about the U.S. Right? Why isn't the U.S. helping us? Well, what are you doing for yourself? But what I wanted to do though is this question of the intervention in Ukraine. There's a furor in the U.S. ruling class on both sides, because we have neocons who are always warmongers. There's nothing new about that, right? The McCain and other neocon solution to everything is always military attack.
He seemed to have never seen a war he didn't like, including the one he participated in.
The guy's incorrigible. Yes. He should be sent to the golf course. Or some other place. But then you've also got on the left, this is even more insidious, you've got the people who believe in the humanitarian bombing. They say responsibility to protect. If you can gin up a story, true or false, this goes back to Serbia in 1999, right? 3 months of bombing for really very little demonstrated reason, or Libya, or other cases, right?
And is the situation in any of those countries any better now after we bombed them?
No, and that's the thing. You look at Libya. Libya is hell on earth. Libya is absolute chaos, the collapse of civilization, the collapse of government, the return to the jungle, right? That's absolute abject horror of Libya. Is that's one of the reasons people in Syria are fighting as hard as they can against those terrorist rebels shipped in by Saudi Arabia and the CIA. They just said, we don't want to do that. And the same thing goes for Algeria. The reason that General Sisi is running such a tough administration there in Egypt is he says, I don't want Egypt to go the way of Libya and collapse into chaos, civil war, microstates, mini-states, warlords, gangsterism.
And is there a connection? I'm sorry, I have so many questions. I hate to interrupt you when you're on a roll, but is there a connection between what happened in Libya and all those arms that Boko Haram has now and what they're doing in kidnapping girls and starting terrorism in that country?
The thing about Gaddafi is he was a mercurial individual, right? He was unpredictable. But because the Arabs rejected him and the West rejected him, he developed a rather ambitious and serious African diplomacy. In other words, he was interested in these forgotten countries in the Sahara and the Sahel. And the fact that you had this huge Libyan desert subjected to law and order, right? Because it was a stern rule of Gaddafi, meant that stability came into those areas. Plus, Gaddafi also did capital improvements. He had the biggest civil engineering project in the world, was his man-made river to get the water out of the aquifers and make that available. He had all kinds of farm investments going in these countries. So you look across, you look at Mali, you look at Niger, you look at Chad, then you look further down into South Sudan, you look into northern Nigeria, as you say. The fact that Libya is no longer a factor of stability, but has become a factor of chaos, is the thing that is reaching way down into the southern tier of Africa. And the big thing, of course, was Gaddafi's arms depots, right? His arsenals have been looted by these terrorists, and that of course is what one of the things that Ambassador Stevens was doing in Benghazi, right? He was meeting with the Turkish consul because they had an airlift of weapons and fighters, terrorist rebels, crazies, jihadis, were being sent from Libya, especially the Benghazi, Tobruk, Derna area, precisely there. They were being sent into Turkey, and then they were being deployed against Syria. So there's a kind of an international effort, and Gaddafi was the one who at least fought that and slowed it down.
You mentioned Benghazi several times. There have been so many congressional hearings, I think 12 or more. There's one more. It seems to me that they ought to ask the right questions about this rather than trying to block Hillary Clinton. Not that I'm a huge fan of hers from running for president. That seems to be the objective of the Republicans there. But if they ask questions about what was that mission doing there anyway, was it serving as a prison, a torture chamber, or arms funneling, or any of those things, then maybe we'd find some insight into Benghazi. What do you think?
The mission of that entity, because it was not even a consulate in Benghazi, was to organize the airlift of weapons and terrorist rebels, international jihadis, right, coming from Indonesia, Chechnya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, all over the place. Those people, mercenaries, were being shipped from Libya to Turkey to then go into northern Syria. However, what happened then on September 11th of 2012 was an October surprise in September. It was an attempt to install Romney as president. As I said, the entire neocon network and the Islamophobia network, which is similar but not identical. Bolton is a kind of a key man who's in both. They decided that they would try to embarrass Obama, that they would try to, deal him a fatal blow in the elections by organizing this thing. If you want to have serious hearings, there are two people you must call. General David Petraeus was the head of the CIA. He controlled 20 to 30 heavily armed, well-trained CIA paramilitaries who were available in that annex, not the consulate so-called, but the annex, and they never intervened. Why didn't Petraeus order them to intervene? Or better yet, maybe he ordered them not to intervene. There was a stand-down order. So he has never been grilled. I want to see him grilled. And then there's General Carter Ham, the head of U.S. AFRICOM, and that controls that area for the U.S. The closest base is not Aviano, Italy, way up, in the northern part of Italy. It's right on Sicily. It's called Sigonella. That's about an hour or two away. They could have had planes and troops. They could have had everything. I want to hear from General Carter Ham. What did you do to send in forces? And I want to hear from General David Petraeus. Why didn't the CIA intervene?
Otherwise, it's just a sham hearing. I guess the other part of that is what are we going to do about all of these hearings in terms of Mr. Obama and anything else? Is he really any better than the neocons in terms of being a warmonger and going into Libya, wanting to go into Syria, and all the rest?
I think right now Obama is tactically better. in the sense that he has avoided the big military escalation, the big war, the big attack that the neocons have been demanded. He came very close to the brink during Syria last September, but when Putin offered a way out, Obama had the sense to take it. And I think that showed a certain amount of courage. I think that was one of the better moments of the Obama administration. Now, if you look at Ukraine, you'll see that Obama shoots his mouth off quite a bit. This past week when he was in Poland, he shot his mouth off, I'm afraid, too much. But if you look at what he's done...
Well, at least there wasn't another red line in the sand, but go ahead.
He has not done anything much for Ukraine. Right? The Ukrainian Yatsenyuk came here and he said, we want weapons, we want troops, we want all these things. And the answer to that was no, no, no. Another interesting thing, in the ruling class, we have people like Jessica Matthews of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's also on the Board of Trustees of Harvard University. This is a ruling class figure. She's in favor of sending one NATO division into Ukraine. She wants one U.S. brigade and then one battalion from 5 to 6 NATO countries. That would make a division in anybody's army.
That seems to me that would lead to worldwide war.
But this is precisely what Obama seems not to want. Now, when we look at this Bergdahl, right, because I think that's germane at this point, what is this hysteria about Bergdahl? I think what you're seeing is an attempted warmonger coup. In other words, a cold coup, not rolling tanks through Washington, but a coup the way it's done here in Washington, where you isolate Obama, you control his sources of information, you control his options, essentially. Obama has put, very foolishly, but Kennedy did it too, so maybe it's not so unusual. The people that Obama has around him, Rice and others, are warmongers. They're interventionists, and he has already. And Hillary is going to tell you about that, right? Hillary says in her book, she, along with Panetta at the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a number of others, tried to get Obama essentially to bomb Syria in 2011 to 2012 especially, and Obama said no. So he has stood up to these people. Concerning Hillary, by the way, in this book, she says she now realizes that her vote to attack Iraq was wrong. But she's also a warmonger on Syria. So I would say you have learned nothing. You're a incorrigible hawk and warmonger, and we simply cannot tolerate such things.
Another one that ought to go to the golf course, huh? Another one that ought to go to the golf course, huh?
Yes.
All right, I need to take one last break before we have one more segment with Dr. Webster Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley, hold on, please.
Sure.
KDK Radio News Time 5:50. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. Dr. Tarpley, I really want to talk about Bo Bergdahl in the 5 or 6 minutes we have remaining with you. It'll be a good lead-in to my nephew, a United Steelworkers official who he and his father and I call him the world's leading authority on everything. He's been studying this Bo Bergdahl matter, but I wonder what your take is on it, sir.
Well, I think you have to see the hysteria of the Republicans, the Libertarians, also in the media. I think, as I said, I think this is a camouflage for an attempted warmonger coup in Washington, and this doesn't have to be an all-at-once coup. It can be a creeping, cold coup. There are all kinds, right? Remember, in the first term of a presidency, the president is controlled by his need to get money to run a campaign to get reelected. In the second term of a presidency, the control is that the oligarchy breaks the power of the president by scandals, right? So Watergate, Monica Lewinsky, Iran-Contra, the breakup of the Bush administration, and so forth. What it is right now, though, is you have this cross-party, bipartisan, neocon and humanitarian bomber consensus that there has to be an attack on Syria at the minimum, stop negotiating with Iran and go for some kind of a confrontation with them, and go for a confrontation with Putin. And that would include doing it in Syria. Right? That's the Anne Marie Slaughter version of that. If you look at the facts of Bergdahl, this is a fairly standard thing, right? Back in the Cold War, we had Francis Gary Powers of the U-2 was exchanged by Kennedy for Colonel Rudolph Abel. Colonel Rudolph Abel was a KGB colonel who ran a Soviet espionage network in the United States from Brooklyn. So this was a valuable, important guy, and he's exchanged for a pilot whose, intelligence value would be, I think, less, although his public fame.
Do you see any kind of link like that, and the fact that the Israelis want, what is his name, freed also?
The Israelis routinely exchange 1,000 people for one of their own, right? They value their own people. Maybe we should learn that. I would say the following. If I were Obama, I would not tell any Republican, especially Saxby Chambliss,
oh, God,
who is a known scoundrel, going back to when he got elected. Remember, he was running against Max Cleland?
That's right, a man who lost both legs and an arm in Vietnam.
And this Saxby Chambliss came along and said, you're not patriotic because you don't support Mad Dog Bush and his Iraq war. That guy's a scoundrel. I wouldn't give him the time of day. For this reason, that now, since we know that there is this push going on, we've seen it since Benghazi, the Republicans are looking for a way to break Obama and make him essentially go along with these wars. There's an issue of trust. The Republicans say, hey, Obama, we don't trust you. We can't do immigration reform because we don't trust you to execute the laws. I would say, if I'm Obama, I'd say, fine, boys, I don't trust you either. I'm not telling you anything in advance because I know there's a good chance you will leak it directly to the Taliban, get the guy killed, and then turn around and try to make that a second Benghazi. That would be my reading. So I wouldn't do it. Now, of course, there's a level of confusion and friction and so forth. I would say, as far as Bergdahl is concerned, he's a victim. He probably has shell shock, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I would just regard him as a victim.
What about the fact that they say he walked away from his unit? Should he be considered a deserter?
Maybe he was going into town to have a few drinks and look for some women. I don't know.
It happened in Vietnam. I know guys who used to go down to Ville unarmed to do that same thing, and it scared me. Let's go, Chris. No, I'm not going, man. It scared me to death.
In other words, the furor, the hysteria, blown 1,000,000 times out of any proportion, indicates to me that the oligarchy is uniting around this idea that they've got to break Obama to the point where he gives them the Syrian war they want, and then they can go on to Iran, and then they're looking for confrontation with Putin.
And where is the anger? They talk about the 6 or so soldiers lost looking for Bergdahl. Where's the anger at the 2,000 or more that have been lost in Afghanistan in an illegal war in the first place?
Right, and we have for four dead in Benghazi. Who this is unfortunate. What about the 6,000 that died in Iraq? The Republicans have never held a hearing about what went wrong with the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction intelligence.
Well, Dr. Tarpley, as always, our time is entirely too short. Is there a website, Tarpley.net, that we can go to and read you?
You can listen to I have a weekly program of my own, World Crisis Radio. I just made an appearance at the Left Forum in New York City last Saturday, so there are all kinds of relatively timely things up there. Articles, I have an article proving that Ukraine is maybe not even a country, that it was created by the German General Staff in 1918 to get food for the German army fighting World War I, and similar things like that. So I urge you. I also look at the United Front Against Austerity. That's a kind of a think tank. And the Tax Wall Street Party, which supports candidates, among them Dan Berdorf in Nebraska, who's running against Ben Sass. And we could do a whole program. I hope we do.
We'll do one shortly, okay?
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Tarpley.
Bye-bye.
Bye.